Giving a lecture today over at Pittsburgh, and her moral of her story is that most of that stuff we really don't use, but the one thing you do use is estimates of measurements of mass transfer for oxygen utilization in biophysical engineering. So that's sort of appropriately reviewing this. You've all seen this before, but I just remind you, shall we say, in the context of the homework that you'll be doing as well. We'll produce a gas phase, mole fraction, pressure, both of which can be manipulated to increase mass transfer. Right, so you can increase this and increase pressure. Henry's law, primarily dependent on what? Is that an hour? No, that's Arizona. Sure. Yeah, okay. So what is the primary dependence of Henry's law? What thing will manipulate that? Partial pressure. Exactly 100%. Okay, remember what you want, how hard you're willing to work for it, and the crafting you want. And a lot of what we do in engineering is we try to separate those two. The partial pressure is a driving force thing. That's the hard, okay. And the resistance, so the Henry's law thing is sort of the opposite of that. You don't want this to be dependent on the partial pressure. Because if it is, then you'll have a dependency in there that doesn't let you separate things, play mathematics games. Okay. So it is the thing that once you know the partial pressure will tell you the solubility of gas, that it's not dependent on it. So we go to the guy with the Trump and Pence thing on him there. Okay. Guilty of being annoying. I like it. What will Henry's law be dependent on? What can I tweak to tweak Henry's law coefficient? Just stand here with it. Look at you. Aren't you the fermenter guy across the street? No, who's the fermenter guy across the street? That's you. Okay. He doesn't really good question. Yeah. Couldn't they? I mean, does anyone sort of see a similarity between these two guys? I do. Okay. Well, sure. I like it. Now, remember that if you don't want Henry's law, which is right hidden here, right? It's going to be if you stick that into there. You want all the things to be independent of each other. That's what's the magic of making it all work. I don't do okay. So I'm going to ask you, what? It is, but solubility is like the result of something. It's not the thing you manipulate. It is a measure of the solubility. Remember. Okay, Henry's law is all about the dilute things that don't want to be in water. So why does temperature? This is a really good question that you don't complain about. Okay, why is Henry's law dependent on temperature? Write me a coherent reason for that, not just remembering it's the case. You can go back to Pence. It's a thinking thing. Right? There is no one taught you this. Okay, that's part of me. Oh, I see it. Yeah, what? One word. It has something to do with molecules. That is so true. I'm looking for a word that is a 9 out of 10. One. That's actually high. Wait, too many words. Guilty. Okay. Two at most. Okay. Yes, I'm going to give you 3 because I'm in a pissed off mood. I'm the judge. Okay. It's a good answer, but it's kind of like vague. I don't want vague. I want very specific. And no, hydrogen bonding. And remember, water kind of likes itself. It has hydrogen bonds and all that kind of stuff. And so it doesn't kind of like other things to get in its way. hanging out with itself. And so as a result of that, hydrogen bonding, now you increase the thermal energy. Okay, and that's what shakes loose. So a little counterintuitive, we have a tendency to think of things being soluble, increase in solubility when it gets warmer. Right? Your sugar isn't melting in your cup, you stick it back in the microwave. Okay? That's not true. Now, you need a mnemonic, so you'll never forget this, ever again. Okay, what would be the mnemonic? We all probably, unless you're gluten intolerant, and way richer than I was as a student, eat spaghetti. Quite frequently, as a matter of fact. I had spaghetti like twice a week for like my entire undergraduate career. So, one aspect of making spaghetti is the mnemonic to remember the effects of temperature on Henry's law.
Salt.
What's that?
Salt, high temperature.
What kind of spaghetti are you making? Okay, we're just making spaghetti here. So, you want to take a shot?
I'm not really sure. Just a random word.
No, it doesn't. We're not to the one word thing. You're allowed to use 5.
Let it get too cold. Let it get too cold.
No, because that's phase transition. Wrong. Well, maybe it's not class. I guess they teach that in thermo too, right? Yeah, but what happens before it gets to a boil?
When you start warming the water, you see a bubble.
Yeah, they're all over the bottom. That's why you guys make shitty spaghetti. Okay? Okay. It's because you look at it and you're not supposed to throw spaghetti in, well, there's differences until it boils, right? So you put it on there and you're anxious because you got to get to your Halloween party. Okay? And it looks like there's all bubbles all inside there. But what happened is you ran cold water in there. Because don't run hot water in because it'll solubilize things like lead and crap, ice. Okay? And so always start with cold water. Cold water will have a higher solubility of gases in it because Henry's law is improved at cold temperatures. You stick it on and it starts to warm up and all those bubbles form because they're coming out of solution. Okay, so that's what's happening as you're making your spaghetti. Okay, keeping that in mind, the other aspect about making bubbles form is that you need nucleation. But since your pot has little nooks and crannies and so forth, and that's why the bubbles all come out all over on the bottom of your tank. But a nucleation cycle allows it to come out. Okay, so at any rate, we now know what they're dependent, because that's the important part of these things. What is, for instance, KO primarily dependent upon? Big guy, right there. Yeah. Diffusivity. Okay. How is it functionally dependent upon that? What's it saying there? Nerve. Verbal. Okay. I have no idea what that is. Okay. That doesn't really mean much about anything, but I do know what the functional dependence of KL will be on temperature. Back to you. Yeah. Okay, so we can now see a competing phenomenon, right? Temperature goes up, and Henry's law, like or solubility, if you want to get it in the right thing, will actually result in it being harder to get it in, but the diffusion coefficient KL will actually go up. So there is a competing phenomenon going on there associated with temperature dependence of mass transfer coefficient relative to temperature dependence of Henry's law, which is down in here. Okay. Anything else in here? Could someone try to articulate how this relates to the maximum cell density on your homework problem? What relates to the cell density? This equation relates to the maximum cell density. This class is so easy. Okay. I'll give you an extra hard question, just for you. Okay. Yeah. Right, and so here, this is the oxygen transfer rate, right? When they are eating most of it, this will tend to go to 0. because they're eating it there. But that doesn't mean they've run out of oxygen. Remember, it means the transport is maximum rate. Okay, so it's just kind of like having barely your next breath, but when this starts to go to 0, your maximum rate of transport occurs, and under that maximum rate of transport, that'll be equal to the maximum biological oxygen demand, which will be equal to the number of cells in there, how fast they're breathing, depends upon how fast they're growing. Yes.
Isn't when we run an oxygen or cells are very efficient in using the oxygen, so
Oh no, they're good at using oxygen. Okay, they love using oxygen because oxygen, remember, is $26 an hour relative to that $2 an hour in the glycolysis versus Krebs cycle thing. So they're good at using it. It's just hard to get it to them. That's the hard part. So, at any rate, A is what the last 3 lectures were about. Making interfacial area per unit volume. Getting bubbles, making them small, dispersing them in the reactor, and so on and so forth. That's the A part. Here, it's the KLO we got. We kind of know this. We understand mole fraction. We understand partial pressure. Hydrostatic head can affect that one as well, a little bit, especially if it's a big tank. And I think that's about it. So, know this slide. Okay, this slide is really important. And it relates to, in many ways, what you ought to know from here. So, the whole thing about mass transfer I talked to you guys before about in the context of the embryo thing. Just a reminder that this is the gas-liquid interface mass transfer. There is also then a transport at the interface between the cells and the actual liquid itself. But typically, this is the one that's actually limiting relative to that. Certainly when you're working with really, really small things like people. Maybe not so much when we're talking about embryos. Could anyone articulate why the embryo thing had a different constraint relative to the solid-liquid mass transfer interface? I'll take it from you. What's that? Yeah, why, in the case that we were dealing with, when we're talking about plant tissue culture and so forth, and somatic embryos and so forth, I tried to emphasize why it was important. There's an importance here across the solid-liquid interface relative to the gas.
is it because the embryos were a lot larger than the bacteria?
Go on. You're adding up. 5.
Oh well, we had to get it to the center of the cell, wasn't it, or the embryo, so that mass transfer.
Yep, keep going. It's still 5. We need that some other word in there. Flux, right? So it's all about the fact that one over here needs to have the oxygen go through that surface. So does this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. Therefore, there's a net flux requirement that is really high for that given surface area because it is a larger organism. That's what then gives a requirement for the gas-liquid solid interface that's pretty high for something that's larger. It's actually organized. I think it's put the lines here because I feel like talking about them. But I will throw out the concept of scale up, which, by the way, is equally valid in the context of scale down. Because if you are an engineer and you're working at the pilot scale, where a lot of people do, okay, a lot of your concerns are running here. You have a choice. You can run something flat out here and actually do better than what they do over there, and then you can bitch and complain about their inability to reproduce your results at the pilot scale. Okay, and what that'll get for you is, I don't know, maybe an ego. Okay, or you can run this one here to mimic the one that's there and tell them how much money they're going to make once you scale things up. The second one is called scale down. You purposely run this one under a condition that will represent the large scale. That means you're being smart about things rather than just being annoying. Okay. Example, when you have a small reactor like this, the surface to volume ratio of this surface up here is actually pretty high. Okay. As you get bigger, you can do the geometry for yourself and prove to yourself that the amount of surface area on this relative to the actual volume is actually going down pretty fast. Okay. So when I have a reactor like a 1 liter one you saw over in the pilot plant there, you can actually be running this thing where you may have upwards of half of the mass transfer coming through the surface area, especially for a 1 million cell reactor where you're not really churning it up in there. Okay. By the time you get to that same reactor around 5,000 liters, it's completely insignificant. There is no noticeable contribution to the interface here relative to the bubbles that are actually inside there due to the effect of the surface area per unit net volume. What strategy might you use to run the smaller reactor so that it would mimic this one here? I'm not picking on you. And you know, Pittsburgh. There. So you're a Pittsburgh team? Okay. Did they win or lose on Saturday?
They won.
Oh, okay. I was just wondering. There seem to be a lot of drunk happy people. So that was my assumption. So how can I run this reactor so that I can mimic the lack of a gas transport occurring from the headspace?
Could you tell me what is the correction?
Oh, we always probably call it fugacity, or activity coefficient, or whatever other thing that we throw out there and pretend that there's some theoretical basis, and it's just a fun stuff. Okay, not a bad idea. That might, but it's not, still not operating that way. And the point is that remember, this is a biological system. It's just not something like the one over there where you have some kinetic expression that doesn't really care about life. Okay, the organisms do care whether the oxygen is there, and it's not just a matter of being the reaction is slowed. It may be that the reaction is, well, dead. Okay, in this case, that's not solving a problem, an operational problem. Ah, there you go. That would be a cool way to actually decrease the surface area by maybe, how about just run it the whole way full and not have any headspace at all? That sounds like a solution. Run that one by your boss. Okay. Guilty. Stupid idea. Why is it a stupid idea?
You have to change like the system itself.
No, there's something else. Why do we have a headspace? Why do we run a nominal bioreactor at 70% of the actual volume? It's not 100%. You don't run them full.
Because then all the water will be
Well, I mean, that's over full. Let's say that we're careful and we don't overfill it. And we accommodate for the 10 to 20% gas volume due to holdup. So we start it at 20%, and then we start blowing bubbles, and then it lifts, but it doesn't lift. There should be something else that's obvious, especially in relation to the tour over in the pilot plant. Oh, yeah. So remember your gut bubbles have to go away before they go up into your condenser and out your filter, your exhaust filter, and everything else. And so we're running it there for a reason. And so we can't really get rid of it. Because you can kind of imagine that if you had, if we had a narrow-necked doohickey here, okay, and we have a certain amount of foam coming up here, what happens is a little narrow thing here. Foam all over the place, right? Okay, so it solves the problem and creates another one, which is called a mess. Okay, and it also blocks the filter and a lot of the bad stuff I told you about. Okay. So what do we do?
decreasing like oxygen peaking.
That would be one way. You're now manipulating the equation in terms of the transport rate, but I would have to do that. I would have to know my mass transfer characteristics of both of them sufficiently well that I could actually predictively manipulate that transport rate based on the gas phase partial pressure. I want you to actually run this thing without having all that full-blown characterization for mass transfer. Yeah, good. I knew you were going to pipe in here eventually because you have seen that they're plumbed that way. but rarely used that way. There's an overlay. There's usually when you have the pipe coming in here, there'll be that little split line that'll come off, and then there'll be a, oh, I can run it in overlay mode. And most people are like, I wonder what the hell that's for. Okay. One of the things that could be for is if you were to run nitrogen into there, and if your gas is functionally plug flow, which we understand from our other class, okay, which it isn't true, but it's close, okay, and so the gas will tend to sweep, right? And then if I mix it in there with a high enough flow rate of an overlay of nitrogen, I can effectively get rid of the actual interfacial transport rate at the top of the reactor. So that's an operational strategy that would be a scaled down strategy, where I would be functionally trying to run it in a way that it looks like this now, because I'll be running at the same power per unit volume, which it turns out is one of the best ways to do a scaling. Not Reynolds number, not whatever other things, no dimensionless groups, unfortunately, help you here. And so I have a means by which to do scaling. Okay? I don't think I have a slide on scaling in general, and I'm not sure why. I looked at that. Oh, I do. Okay. I was looking for it. I must have found it. Okay. So, how do we scale up? We know how to scale up pipes. Chemist guy. Okay. Bernoulli is how, remember, Bernoulli is the one that doesn't have even viscosity involved. It's completely useless for scaling up flowing pipes. But it is a very engineering dead fast, and it's in the right class. So if it's in the right class, then you get, I don't know, 3 out of 3 or 4, depends on the move. Oh, come on. Scaling flow in real pipes. What if I'm in a bad, what? Moody. There you go. Okay, so the Moody diagram, okay, and then you scale based on the Reynolds number. Okay, so so that's, but and Reynolds number sounds like a thing that you would scale by, because that's what you learned, right? You learned that you can scale with dimensionless groups. That's why we did it. What was the famous dead guy for making dimensionless groups if you don't happen to know what they are?
Gibbs.
No. Famous castle. Hmm?
No.
What? Oh, it's Halloween. No, nobody's like how you make dimensionless groups for a physical situation. No, anyone? No one. Buckingham Pi Theorem?
Oh, yes, there you go.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, okay. So now you would make up your various dimensionless groups and so forth. But it works quite well for relatively simple characterized systems, particularly, and this one obviously is not one of those. So, the other thing that you learned about dimensionless groups was dynamic and geometric similarity. What does that mean? How do you do a problem based on dynamic or geometric similarity? So much tuition, so little time. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. You set dimensionless groups equal to each other. You vaguely remember back to that. Okay. You either divergence. Okay. Okay. A divergence is if you want to make a correlation, you take your first dimensionless group, this, and then you make it times a constant and n sub y, and then you put a thing to the c, and then you take n sub z and you take it to d. Okay. this is how you make correlations. Okay. They all look like they're fancy and fun and that, but how do we get A, C, and D? What? Data. Take data, do regression analysis. Okay. Another part of Chemistry 340 that I really hit hard. I don't have time to teach you guys now. Maybe. I don't know. We'll see. Okay, so you get these. When you see this, what kind of a thing do you normally expect that you would do to get that actual parameter analytically? The old school way, take the log of it, right? Because you take a log of it, that thing to the thing goes out up front, and it becomes a coefficient you would get by linear regression. Okay. But you don't need to do that, because that's back in the dark ages. Now all you do is just stick it in a spreadsheet, and you put the numbers in there, and you let solver just find your A, C, D, and then you don't have to linearize it. The number will be different whether you linearize it or not linearize it, because you're shifting where the variance is going to be based on the log of the variance and so forth. So, little lessons. Okay, so this dimensional analysis is correlation development. And the other one is when you have quote-unquote dynamic similarity and so forth, is where you take n sub x for the little guy, and you set it to n sub x of the big guy. And then you do things like say, oh, they have dynamic and similarity and so forth. If I'm going to run this one at this RPM and I put the numbers in, like the power number, I can find out how, just what RPM to spin it at by ratios. It's that whole ratio thing that you vaguely remember from, I don't know, should have had it before. But maybe, okay. So this is the other approach to, this is correlation development. Correlations, though, don't typically let you scale. Correlations let you interpolate and extrapolate. Interpolate, yay. Extrapolate, yay. Okay. Okay. When you see a correlation for, like, say, a mass transfer coefficient for your homework problem, the key is that you want the data to have been taken for a range that is somewhat similar to the situation you're working with, otherwise you're extrapolating. So you don't define a correlation not by the little numbers you get from the book, but by the range of the dimensionless groups that the experiments were taken so that it's accurate and you're interpolating and not extrapolating. Everyone get that? Okay. So, if you do this, I guess the point is this, okay? These are different ways to scale things. Okay? Now, tip speed, as it turns out, kind of seems to make sense, right? If I have a little reactor like this, and I'm going around, I would say, oh, I think I'll do it at the same RPM. But remember, so if I'm a little reactor, and I'm going like this, and then I put my arm out, okay, and I'm going around the same rate, obviously the tip speed just went way up. If the damage is being, okay, which one do you want to be hit by? Okay, me going like this, or me putting it out there and going like this? Okay. Obviously, you don't want to be hit when I have it out there at a distance, because it's going up. The speed of that is actually going up quite a bit, right? And so you could be like, well, I can kind of in my head think about the amount of damage that's being created, or, quite frankly, the ability to break up a bubble, right, is probably dependent a little bit on what that tip speed would be. That's not a bad criterion. It works pretty good in the Chinese hamster ovary cell world and some things like that. But it does result in the RPM going prohibitively up. Especially remember that whole power torque thing? And when that goes up, what is the power on the end term? Full class. Okay. I'm like, I didn't say this one. Okay, okay. So at any rate, not a bad idea. Okay. Remember, there is such a thing as a Reynolds number for an impeller. So we could play the game of constant Reynolds number. Little reactor, big reactor. Keep the Reynolds number constant. You can do things like, well, if I'm going to keep it constant, well, density and viscosity aren't going to actually probably change too much. And so as this gets bigger, I'm going to have to go to a smaller RPM. You can see that, right? Right in the actual equation itself. But if you do that, what happens is the power per unit volume goes down pretty fast. And power per unit volume is one of the strongest things that correlates to the mass transfer rate. It's the ability to tear things up, which is what you are trying to do for the bubble side of things. And so constant power per unit volume is the typical one for microbial fermenters. I told you in the homework problem, 20 horsepower per 1,000 gallons. That is a nominal number. That would be sort of my starting point for a fermentation. And I think we managed to increase it. Because you can. If you can increase it, you would increase it. Because if you can't increase it, you'll increase the mass transfer coefficient. So the only thing you have to do is not kill them. Okay? And so that results in a moderate increase in the rotation speed. Okay? And if this is a moderate increase in that, then it only gives us a third power in that. It's not going to be so much extra power that will have to be compensated by a small. So the tip speed here that I mentioned there as well, I don't know why it's here twice, is the reduction in power per unit volume. So if I try to maintain that, and it makes sense if you think about it. If I'm going to try to go to the same speed out here, I'm going to be going pretty slow compared to the one that's here like this. And so the power per volume is going to go down. Power per volume goes down, harder to break up bubbles. You won't get the mass transfer that you actually need. So notice the little red thing at the bottom here is this is one of the reasons why we don't teach you this. We don't like it when there's not an answer. Because we're telling you the truth. There isn't a right answer. It depends on the cell system that you're working with, how much they can tolerate the shear that's there, and quite frankly, how valuable is the product, the density you want to run at, so on and so forth. All of that comes into it. And so it depends a lot on the biological interface to this as to what will work best for you. By the way, one of the things you typically last resort in running a reactor, which sounds easy if you want to increase oxygen transfer rate, would be increasing oxygen, partial pressure. That's like a no-brainer, right? It'll always work. Why do you avoid that? Money. Money. Okay? More importantly, it's not just money. It's wasted money. Right? Because remember, these reactors are operating extremely low gas conversions. Right? There's that 21% oxygen in and 20 going out. So if I supplement with extra oxygen, the amount that I'm getting for the transport may improve that gas-liquid interface, but 95% of it's going out the tank. So because of the low gas conversion, I'm not actually getting much for my money. I do increase the transport rate. I'm also wasting the gas because air is generally free and oxygen generally not free. So, at any rate. So, we will apparently end on this particular slide because it's a good schematic of thinking. As I do want to give you guys at least one little exercise in process control. I can count a lot on my hands of the horrified people that I talked to at ChE about the fact that we don't have process control. And so, let's start with dissolved oxygen. Because dissolved oxygen is something relatively easy. You stick your probe inside the reactor, you measure it. If it goes down, I want to make it go up. And so I can control based on a constant DO. The question is, what do I do for my set point? It's an interesting question. Does it really matter what your set point is? What would be the best possible set point from a standpoint of making the most money? Way in the back. Okay, 100% Wrong. Okay, 0. Because if you set it to 0, you will maximize the transport rate for all the rest of the money you're putting into the system. The only question is, do your cells really care if they can't see their next breath? You know, right? Because it's coming at the maximum rate, and I'm breathing it in as fast as you give it to you. Now, simple test. Find out what kind of an organism you are. Take a piece of Tygon tubing and get in a pool. And breathe through your mouth and out through your nose. It's always available. Okay? Okay? How many of you will freak out? The vast majority. Okay? Because you don't kind of like the fact that your next breath isn't like there. Okay? Especially if you restrict the tubing, so it's kind of hard to get that next breath. Okay? Well, it's kind of like, oh, well, we went through this once before, right? Waterboarding. Okay, so I mean, okay, it's just a different form of it. Okay, and a little psychological test. But we used to play these kind of games with my brothers. Okay, because you get into this. No, not waterboarding. Not waterboarding. But you know, to get into a muddy pond, you know, and have a piece of Tygon tubing and see like how long you can actually, how deep you can go with a piece of tubing. It's not this interesting. So that would be, but typically we set 50, what I said to you, what DO do you set your reactor to? Have you run the reactor yet?
Yeah, we run the reactor, but we never had a Cascade control so they actually do.
So you just big old tank, run the impeller, throw the shit in. Yeah, I know, okay. Got it. Okay. You're not making any money, guarantee you. Okay. It would not be atypical in the cell culture world to set it to 50%. Even a little bit lower if you were trying to tweak it. Because think about it. If I set it to 50%, I threw away half of my mass transfer. I could double my money if I could increase it up to essentially 0. Right? I just increased my transfer rate. Why wouldn't you run it at 0? What's the constraint for doing that? Besides, because by the way, they're okay with the whole waterboarding thing. Yeah. Okay, so it's very unstable. That's a bad thing from that. There's one a little bit more. Why might it vary? Because you put your probe typically here in the tank, which is the dumbest place to put the probe, and they're always done that way. Why? It's near the best mixing. It's near where the bubbles are being broken up. And so by putting a probe here, I'm actually not going to know what the oxygen is going to be in the worst places in the tank, and that's really where you ought to put your DO probe. You ought to put your DO probe in the worst possible place, then I could sneak that on down. But if I'm going to have it close to where there's actually going to be a mass transfer issue, then it actually isn't necessarily indicative. Now, it's a little more accurate here. Well, this is actually, let's assume this was a Rushton impeller, which it's not. Okay, it's more than that. But if it was a Rushton, I would be throwing the liquid straight at this probe, right? What does that do? Gets rid of the boundary layer mass transfer around the probe. So it makes your probe more accurate if you're a probe buyer. Okay? But you're putting it in the place because the velocity is so fast past this, right? It's going to eliminate any boundary layer mass transfer at the end of my probe, which is, that's how they work. Remember, it's the diffusion rate of oxygen through a membrane on the end of this thing. So yeah, it gives you a very accurate measure in the place in the tank, which is the least important. If I put it in a less mixed part of the tank, I now will have a lag associated with the probe and mass transfer, so it doesn't give you as accurate a measurement, but it probably is more important relative to the actual operation itself. Okay. So now, what do? Probe. Probe is in here. My DO is going low. Easiest, cheapest thing to do, turn up the RPM, right? So he mentioned cascade control. What does cascade control do? You take the cheapest thing first, and you max it out. Then you take the next cheapest thing, and you max it out. And then you take the next. So cascade control is based on the basic concept of why do what's the cheapest in that particular order. Increasing the RPM is kind of easy, right? And I feedback controller. My controller says my DO is going down. You increase the actual RPM. Next, what might you do? Well, actually, I'll add one additional one. Because one of the things that most people would think is if I have this probe in there and I don't have enough oxygen, what would be your first reaction to get more to it?
Get more oxygen. So,
Yeah.
there's a flow.
The flow rate, right? I mean, you know, your brother's underneath there, and he's kind of like kicking at your head. It's like, you know, you could, I don't know, you could blow some down to him. Okay, that would work. Okay, but remember that will only work if you predictably increase the mass transfer rate as a result of the increased flow rate. The inherent problem is that if I increase the gas flow rate and it causes coalescence because there's more gas in there than the propeller can break up, it won't go up. And in fact, you'll actually decrease your mass transfer rate by increasing your gas flow rate if you're operating at high gas flow rates. But if I start at really low gas flow rates, then I know that a little bit more gas in there will actually improve things. So as long as I'm not swamping my impeller, and let's say I'm less than 20% of the power for isothermal gas expansion relative to the actual power number and so forth, I can say my cascade control will allow me to increase gas flow rate, and that's cool because it is really cheap to increase gas flow rate. Then I might say, once after I'm done doing that, now I'll increase the RPM until one of two things happens. Okay, cells break up. Cells break up and die. That would be a bad thing, which you can calculate based on the Calcamo-Roth eddy length to know your power per unit volume and whether or not you're likely to do that. Or the other one will be, hey, you just got a maximum. Everything has a maximum RPM. I mean, you can only, you know, it's not like the dial. You just max the sucker out, you know, and that's the other boundary. And then what do you do after you max out that boundary? Okay. Okay. What do we do next? Way in the back. And no, we maxed it out in the beginning, and now if we're maxed out on the RPM, and I put more air in there, boom, it crashes. There are 3 more answers left. Yeah. Okay, that's the last one, okay, last resort. Why? Because the organisms may not like the temperature to be lower, but that would work, right? If I decrease the temperature, I get 2 things for my buck. One is I increase the solubility of the gas because of Henry's law effect. The second is I decrease the demand because the respiration rate will go down because they're cooling. So I get that is the last resort. And in fact, that was for a long period of time. That was actually a trade secret between a lot of companies of how to lift over that barrier, because their cells would get really pissed off if they ran out of oxygen when waterboarded. So you could just tweak down the temperature just for like 15 minutes during the run at the right time, and that would actually let you get through there and then run on that to the higher productivities. Okay. But the other obvious ones here would be to increase the oxygen partial pressure, pay for oxygen. That'll work. What's the one more left, and then you're done? There's no feed here, it's batch. Okay, sorry. Life. Increase the pressure as well, right? So if I increase the pressure in the tank, I would also increase the partial pressure of oxygen as well. And so that would be the other option. I mean, that's it. There are hardly any other options. So get out of here. And well, next time, I guess. Darn it, I wanted to get to the mouse-to-mouse lecture. I can't wait to tell you about mice and monkeys. I guess we'll do that next time. Oh, what? Oh, my cabin. I barely saw a single person crack a smile as I walked the whole way across campus. You guys really suck, because, dude, I don't know. Like, no sense of humor whatsoever.
Come on.